Welcome everybody to another Village Torah portion discussion. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew. We finished with the book of Leviticus last week, and we are now into the book of Numbers. And the book of Numbers in Hebrew is called Sefer Bemidbar, and this name Bemidbar is the same name as this week's Torah portion, which is in the desert, Bemidbar. That's where the Jews found themselves. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to bring it up now. We'll go right to. So the Torah portion kicks off. The reason it's called Bemidbar, it's funny because normally Torah portion names are named after the first or second word. This word is actually like 4 or 5 words in. So it's right here. And so God speaks to Moses Bemidbar Sinai, so that God speaks to him in the wilderness of Sinai. So several words in. That's actually not what this Torah portion is about. It's not about necessarily the setting, although it does have something to do with it. This actually, what we will encounter is a census. So just to take a step back, the first handful of chapters in the book of Bemidbar, of book of Numbers, that we have here are all about census. And it's the census of all the different tribes. And then there's even a census that goes specifically into the various families, the priestly families. There's really specific counting. I'm more interested sort of in the broader counting, although that's totally a really interesting separate conversation about the different priestly countings and what that is about. But the idea of census, of taking count, is an interesting one. At least I'm interested in it. It's actually a commandment here to take accounting of Jews. And I think to some degree, actually, you know what, I'll get into that later. So let's look at it. That we have here, the first three verses here. So on the first day of the second month in the second year following the exodus from the land of Egypt, the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting, saying, "Take a census of the whole Israelite community by the clans of its ancestral houses, listing the names, every male head by head. You and Aaron shall record them by their groups from the age of 20 years and up, all those in Israel who are able to bear arms." What's interesting, one of the things that, I mean, it's not the craziest thing, but the word is not census in the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, it is literally Su'u et Rosh Kol Hadat. So I'm going to do this. That it's Su'u et Rosh Kol Adas B'nai Israel. Take a census. It's literally like lifting up heads. If people's heads were to be lifted up, that's what it is here.
What do you mean lifted up?
Meaning the language for census is not actually census. I mean, that's not, how do we say census in biblical Hebrew? It is raising up heads. Su'u et Rosh Kol Adat B'nai Israel. Take a census by the listing the names, but it's literally lifting up head. It's the way of saying count people by people, which is, it's kind of an amusing expression, kind of amusing phrase, but that's what it is. Lifting up heads is the biblical way of expressing take a census.
Okay, I understand that, yes.
Okay, great. So now there's kind of, I mean, God actually doesn't tell Moses or Aaron, for that matter, why. Why should you count? And also, why now? Why are they taking a census now? One of the things, so it's curious what the deal is. We have here Rashi, and I've spoken about Rashi before. Rashi is an acronym for Rabbi Solomon Yitzchaki, a French or Franco-German commentator, perhaps the prince of all biblical commentators. And he says, sort of why? Sort of giving an explanation of like, why is God asking this? So he says, he writes in Hebrew, mitoch chivatan l'fanav. So Rashi says because they were dear to him. So he counts them every now and then. So when they went forth from Egypt, He counted them in the 13th chapter of Exodus, when many of them fell in consequence of their having worshipped the golden calf. He counted them to ascertain the number of those left in Exodus 30, when he was about to make his Shekhinah, but his divine presence, dwell amongst them. He again took their census, for on the first day of Nisan, the tabernacle, the Mishkan, or as I like to call it, God's apartment, the tabernacle was erected, and then shortly afterwards, on the first day of Iyar, which is the Hebrew month, he counted them. Okay, so this is Rashi's explanation. They were dear to him. The Jewish people are dear to God, and he counts them at various times. Okay, I actually really like this next. Now this is a midrash. The next thing that we're about to encounter. So this is from Bemidbar Rabbah, which is it's a midrash. I've spoken about midrash here before, which is a narrative expansion, and this sort of rabbinic narrative expansion from probably, who knows, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th century of the Common Era. It's definitely many centuries ago, and the rabbis try to use midrash to try to figure out what's going on. So what's this about? So they take this verse from Song of Songs. There are 60 queens, my dove, my undefiled is just one. So they say, okay, what is this a comparable, or maybe there's a parable here. So a person who had a bundle of glass stones would bring them to the market, but this person would not notice their number, since this person would not care about them, as they were just glass. But this person had a bundle of precious pearls, and this person would take them out and count them by number, and then put it away, counting them. Similarly, so to speak, the Holy One, blessed be He, said to Israel, you are my children, as it says from the book of Isaiah, that are born by me from the birth. Therefore I count you all the time. Therefore it is said, count all the firstborn males. That is, and going back to the Song of Songs verse, there are 60 queens, but my dove, my undefiled, is just one. This is Israel. So what this midrash, this rabbinic narrative expansion here, is trying to do is say, why does God care? Like, God theoretically should have no interest in how many Jews there are, but maybe it's like a precious special relationship, and that's what's going on in this midrash, this rabbinic expansion. Is that sure, there are lots of different nations out there, lots of different peoples, but God's interested here in the nation of Israel, and that's why God wants the census to be taken. Okay,
Now, do they count?
Yeah,
Let me ask you this: do they count women and children, or just men?
So it seems to be that here, so in this third verse, they're interested in the men who are 20 years and up, who are able to bear arms. So it seems like it's more of like a military census. Kind of reminds me of like the draft in America. They want to know.
Go ahead.
It sounds like they want to know who can fight, who to assess their fighting ability.
So they don't want to know the population. They just want to know the people that can fight.
Right.
Okay.
They want to know their fighting numbers. So it's not everybody, although it's interesting because later scholars have tried to extrapolate how many were there. And they say, okay, well, if you figure roughly, what about anybody under 20, man or woman? So what about that? That's a whole bunch. And then what about women? Obviously, there's a corresponding number. So do you double, triple? Whatever numbers come about to figure out how many Israelites actually were at that time, how many were there? Do you triple, quadruple? Obviously, some sort of multiplications needed to try to figure out the overall number of the census. But this seems like more of like not necessarily a military census, but at least a fighting capability census. which I think makes it even more interesting that the explanations here have nothing to do with military stuff.
No.
Rashi just simply mentions because they were dear to him. Like it's just about the entire nation. Same with Bemidbar Rabbah here, this narrative expansion. It's just about the entire people, and they're more interested in sort of the broad. Oh, actually, you know what? We're about to get to this next source. This is good. This brings us to the next source. So this is Rushbam, which is an acronym for Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, who was a grandson of Rashi. So he says, here's what he has to say, and this sort of responds to what directly relates to what we were just discussing. So because from this point on, the Israelites were headed for the land of Israel, and all men over the age of 20 were enlisted in the army for war. Because on the 20th of the second month, the Torah speaks of the people leaving the region of Mount Sinai, the cloud having lifted off the tabernacle, the Mishkan, God's apartment, and began to move ahead of the people. In that chapter, verse 29, Moses invited his father-in-law Yitro to accompany the people who were now journeying toward the promised land. God issued the command to count the people so that one could keep track of how many soldiers there were. So that I think more directly relates to it. In Rashbam, if I could just pull out a little bit more, sort of a more meta comment, Rashbam typically talks more about sort of a more logical reading of the texts than necessarily his grandfather. His grandfather does a lot of more stylistically midrashic of these narrative expansion. His grandson Rashbam does a lot more sort of broader literary reads of it, and I think that's what he's doing here. That whereas that both what his grandfather wrote and that Midrash talk more broadly about the people. It's nice, but Rashbam here is saying, why men? Why only 20 up? It's to know the military capability. Does that help?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
And it indicates that they were always being attacked.
Well, they definitely needed to be on their feet. This is actually kind of amusing. This one by this Akedas Yitzchak. So Rabbi Isaac Arama of the 15th century asks, why all the seemingly dull details of the census? Why are they necessary? Did God not know the number of Israelites encamped in the desert? Taking account of them one by one, Rabbi Arama argues, serves to teach that each one has individual worth and is not just a member of the collective. They were all equal in stature, he writes, and yet the stature of each one was different. Okay, lovely stuff. Lovely material. Okay. You know what? I can't help it. I'm just going to do this. So we have in the Talmud, much later on, we have this statement that Rabbi Elazar, who lives in the 4th century, he says, whomever counts a group of Jews violates a prescriptive commandment, a mitzvah, as it is said, and the number of the children of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured. So, and then we have Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, who says, actually, you violate 2 prescriptive commandments, quoting from Hosea. So, really interesting, like why were they counted if it's these later 4th century rabbis saying not to? Maybe that's an interesting separate conversation that we could get into at another point in time. But for here, it seems to be that this is really trying to figure out military might capabilities, just
right.
The internal ones. At the same time, for us to look at, and when we encounter and read, to get a sense of sort of more generally, how many children of Israelites were there at the time? And as you point out, what about people under 20? What about women? Because those are not included in that count. Although this seems to be more of a military census. Any questions on it?
Yes.
Yeah.
What did the contemporary rabbis say about this?
So as you can imagine, there are loopholes. There are um, hmm. Yeah, there are loopholes. I don't actually, it's funny now that you mention that, I don't know all the details. I know that one thing that when people try to count for a minion, they try to count 10, they, instead of actually going through and counting 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, what they'll do is they'll use a biblical verse that just happens to have 10 verses. So they're not counting the people, they're counting the verses or the
Ah,
words in the verse. I'm sorry, the words in the verse. So
why
they'll
is
use
that?
that, right? They'll use that loophole. I'm just counting words in this verse that happen to be this number of people here. So that's a loophole that people use. This is not the only time that we see a counting of the people, because we also see earlier in the 30th chapter of Exodus that they are to also tisa et rosh b'nei Israel, that they're supposed to again lift up the heads of Israel and count them. But here it seems to be that they give a half a shekel. So it's not that people are literally going through and actually counting heads, that people give a half shekel. And so through that, you just count up how many shekels there are. And here also, by the way, it is 20 and up. It's not clear. Oh yeah, it seems to also be the men. Here's the other thing I wanted to mention. There is a later census in the book of Samuel that David takes account. So there is a later census. And again, it is about military might and counting. Nevertheless, that all having been said, Jews like to know how many we are. We
Right.
want to, like, granted, I mean, one of the biblical verses we encountered in that Talmudic passage was that the Jews cannot be numbered, right? We're going to be more
Right.
numerous. We're like the grains of sand. We can't really be counted. We're going to be very numerous. Okay, that's all great, but we still like to know, how big are we? How many are we? At the same time, like, the Jewish nation has never been concerned with any notions of supremacy, superiority. It's, for us, it's not. We have no interest in having more numbers of people in our nation than any other nation. We know that we're always going to be a pretty small nation. We're not going to be a massively vast nation. We know that. We understand that. We get that. But we're always really curious, how numerous are we? And we have, it seems to be certainly in the last few decades, we've been having these surveys of Jewish demographics, certainly in America. We had the 1990 National Jewish Population Survey. We had another one in 2001. There was the Pew survey in 2013. There's another one coming out very soon, actually, very, very soon. I don't even know when they're releasing it, but I've heard talk of a new one to give us a sense of how many Jews there are in America.
Hmm.
So, which is interesting because it would almost seem to be that certainly these American Jewish, population survey studies that we've been having for the last few decades really ultimately do stem from the biblical surveys, the biblical censuses that we see in both this week's Torah portion and in the book of Exodus, as we just encountered. So it would seem to be like there is actually biblical precedent to some degree, even if the biblical precedent was about fighting men for war. But here we just want to have a sense of how numerous we are, despite and maybe that's a topic for a separate time for me to look into and report back of this Talmudic prohibition against counting Jews. I don't know the intricacies of that, but certainly something I should look into, and I'd be happy to report back. Thank you so much for joining. This is great, and thank you.
You're very welcome. I'll look forward to next week.
Awesome, wonderful.
Thank you.
Absolutely, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom to you as well.
All right.